ask folks to quietly take the last pull of coffee as we get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Bob Jaquay. I'm with the George Gundin Foundation, and it is my pleasure to join colleagues in the Fund for Our Economic Future, Denise San Antonio Zeman, who is the head of the St. Luke's Foundation, and Brian Frederick, who is the head of the Lorraine Community Foundation, in hosting what is one of four various kind of localized gatherings to discuss what matters to veterans. I'll come back in just a moment to talk about that along with Denise Zeman. But I would like to, and have the privilege of introducing Brian Zimmerman. I think, how many of us are actually natives of Cuyahoga County? I don't know how many of you remember, but as a kid, I remember teachers, probably 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, talking about the visionaries of about 100 years ago who thought of the emerald necklace. The emerald necklace resonates even if the lectures don't. And there was, I learned, Edward Stinchcomb, who was this visionary landscape architect who had the vision to try to create a preserve all around the Cleveland area to give us a great and lasting resource that would continue on in perpetuity. I think it's great for us in having our meeting in this region that includes Cuyahoga, Lake, Geauga, and am I missing anybody? Medina County, I believe, is part of our gathering. Anyhow, anyone from either region is welcome. But we're trying to have localized conversation today, but that we come to this place in particular for a couple of reasons. One is that we're meeting in Youngstown, we're meeting in Akron, we're meeting in Canton. I actually think it's important for us to meet in one of the very largest cities of our region, Parma. But we're also meeting in a very new facility in a place that has taken this very, very important century-old heritage and with new, vigorous leadership, taking our natural resources in this very new, wonderful place, positioning these great resources for another century ahead and for long-term vision. The kind of spirit of this place, we're hopeful, infuses our conversation about what matters to veterans. To welcome us, to give us some real insights into this place and the importance of the Metro Parks is the new, competent, vigorous Leadership for the Future, Brian Zimmerman, the head of the Cleveland Area Metro Parks.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to West Creek. This facility here is really only a week old. We just opened just last week, last Friday. About 10:30 in the morning, we had 500 guests here, and it was an absolutely fantastic opening for this reservation. A little history about this reservation. It actually started, like a lot of things do, on a kitchen table with a couple of napkins and some dreamers. And a number of folks got involved, and really the culmination is what you see here today is an example of approximately, there's over 30 plus best management practices that are put into place. When you get a chance, I challenge you to stay around, stick around after your meeting today. Gail and some of the staff will be here to kind of go through a few of the components that are outside and inside. One of the neatest features, and Jeremy, I'm going to give him a little props in the back, that map back there that you see as you enter into the room is a one of a kind, but it really represents our watershed. As Bob was saying, Stinchcomb, our founder, really built this system on a riparian corridor concept, which is really embracing our rivers. Almost 100 years later, we just turned 97 last week, June 23rd. When you look at what we're trying to do here is really interpret what he built this system on. He designed this system with the Olmsted brothers. It is over 85% complete of his original vision, and we're really proud to bring this facility full circle here within the Metro Parks confines. So just a quick little, couple little snippets, and we'll get you to your program. A few kind of very interesting things about Cleveland Metro Parks. Again, 97 years old, and we're funded by one one levee across the Cuyahoga County and Hinckley Township. Hinckley is kind of the pendant that hangs off the bottom, and most have said that, with the lakefront acquisition, that kind of helps work on completing the upper portion, but we're not done yet. As some have seen, the Acacia Reservation kind of was this thought process that it may have gotten developed or nobody really knew what would happen to it, and about 2 months, starting in August and September of last year, the Conservation Fund of America came forward and bought the property and turned it over to Cleveland Metro Parks. So we're still in the acquisition mode, is really what I was trying to get across with that. We're working on some of the corridors down on the Heron Rookery, which is like in the East Branch area. One of the things of note, interesting when we're talking about economic competitiveness, Nate Kelly's in the background, and Nate was one of the first people that reached out to me when I got here in town, and now with the County Executive Fitzgerald's office. We talked about the the relativity of parks and how it can help drive the economy and help create a competitive advantage for this community. And I think we're proving it day in and day out. You look at John Crompton, one of the professors down at Texas A&M, he calls it the proximate principle. The land that's closest to or adjacent to parks has the highest relative value. He's also done a tremendous amount of studies. We do a lot of grant writing. We have a couple of our grant writers, Donna's in the background and Jen's here as well. We're really putting a focus on how we're doing things. We're actually partnering with the Trust for Public Land, and I'm very proud to say the Gunn Foundation was the first supporter of our economic impact study, benefit study for parks, that we'll be completing this year with the help of the Cleveland Foundation. There's only 5 other park districts in the country that have done something like this, and we think it's a very important time in the history of Cleveland as we're approaching our 100-year celebration, really looking at how relative we are to the economy and the overall health of the region. We've convened the park directors from all of the county areas around here approximately a month ago in this very same room, and really talked about how synergistically we're working together. We're working on connecting these park districts. The National Park System was representative as well. So it's a really excellent time to be here in Northeast Ohio. I almost feel like a native. I've been here about three and a half years, and our family's really adopted this community and what's going on. There's a bright future for Cleveland, and again, this facility here is only a week old. I challenge you to come back with your children or your grandchildren, or just take a lunch and walk through. There's some interactive screens and displays. There's a nice little room back off the back here. A couple other, just one last little really interesting thing about sustainability, which has been one of our core missions. There's a lot of furniture that was actually repurposed from the old VA hospital down in Brecksville that actually makes up a lot of the components of this particular building. So it's got that sustainable side. And on the table, you'll see part of the strategic plan from our 100-year celebration looking forward into the 2020 plan. And then there's a new brochure on kind of living your life in Cleveland Metro Parks. There isn't a speaking engagement that I go to that people don't remember either, getting picked up by the Rangers or partying in the Metro Parks or having their first date in the Metro Parks, but there's always a story about how people are connected to Cleveland Metro Parks. So without further ado, I'll turn it back over. Welcome to the center, and I look forward to a good set of dialogue. So thank you.
So as Brian said, we have napkins, we have tabletops, and we have engaged visionaries. Maybe we won't be planning a West Creek reservation, but we can plan a future for an economic region. What matters to metros, that we're going to hear about in a few minutes from Emily Garr, is something that the Fund for Our Economic Future, a collaboration of 65 separate independent funders who've agreed to come together, subordinate their natural instincts to be very, very independent and guarding their prerogatives and making their decisions quite independently, to work together in collaboration for the benefit of the region's economy. When we started over a decade ago, one of the things that we proclaimed to be a hallmark of our work is to be data-driven and to have research underpinnings to our work. Today's work, while we have some very new and interesting and challenging things in this report, is the 7th in the iteration of our rollout of what matters to metros. We've actually rebranded this one. We called it for many years the Dashboard of Economic Indicators, almost like, you envision putting your foot on the pedal and dials would start to move and needles would indicate how fast you were going. We realized that it really wasn't like a dashboard because we were pushing on the engine and dials were really slow to change. But we knew at least the direction finder was working. So we decided to rebrand this thing to something that was much more accurate, but actually more meaningful to stimulating dialogue. We're not trying to, mile by mile, minute by minute, calculate how fast we're going and how certain kinds of things are performing on the engine. We're actually trying to work together over a long haul to find our collective way to a better future in a very, very, very complicated environment, as Emily will talk about in the main presentation. We've used this tool to guide our work and deploy over $70 million, we think, to very good effect. But as our funders came together about a year and a half ago to talk about where we collectively were heading together, one of the things that we were told by the community, one of the things that we were told by consultants we had engaged, is that we have to try to do a better job of knitting together region with more localized activity. That there is a lot of benefit, and we've achieved a lot by talking about things at the regional scale, but that collectively, we, by knitting together both the regional and the local, will have a much greater effect of harnessing the kind of progress we collectively need to make for a better economic future. And so, as we roll out this document that we are talking about on a regional basis, we realize that we have to listen to people that are practitioners, that are engaged citizens on the ground working in their communities that have every bit as much stake as somebody with a purely regional perspective on economic progress and economic future. The intention today is not just to roll out and to convey what matters to Metros from the research, but to truly engage in dialogue with you, to hear, to interact, and to have discussion between many of us in this room as we try to figure out not just how we're doing and where we have to go, but how new combinations and new relationships might get us further down the road. It is a great privilege of mine to introduce our principal speaker who's going to talk about what matters to Metros. My colleague, Emily Garr, comes to the fund from the Brookings Institution. She's been a Fulbright Fellow studying abroad on economies and how places work. And she's decided, with a lot of options and a lot of places in the world she could have gone, to come back home and to bring her talents to bear here for the future of our place. She's newly married. I think I just met her husband for the first time. Emily's husband, Paul Pachetti, is in the audience. This is a very exciting thing for me. Yes, I agree. So, as I introduce Emily, I'm going to try to ask you to think about a rhetorical question. Yesterday, our colleague, Denise San Antonio Zeman, sent around a wonderful email that talked about how her foundation, in deliberating how to deploy precious assets with lots and lots of competing demands for their use, to commit and renew to the Fund for Economic Future in a substantial $300,000, that's a big grant by any foundation stretch, $300,000. And she cited this work and this research and some of the newest findings as the compelling underlying reason why they could re-engage. I hope you riff on this later. Thank you. But that kind of, how does this work fit with what I'm trying to do, is the kind of rhetorical question we're going to ask of you to think about as Emily is rolling out this important data and the new findings. In some ways, we've all watched the Supreme Court and various topics in the last week. The lawyer in me says, this research in part affirms important stuff that has guided our work in the past. And yet, there are new rulings that are creating new law, breaking new ground that we all have to pay attention to and figure out how it gets implemented and what it means to our lives. So, to talk about what gets affirmed and what is new that we have to engage in, I give you Emily Garr.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you guys all for being here. We're very excited to introduce What Matters to Metros to a broader audience, and I'm kind of relieved to say that many of you in the audience are already familiar, so I'm that much less nervous as I come back to Cleveland. We have been to Youngstown, Akron, and Canton so far, engaging with those communities. We've been to Southeast Michigan, talking to some foundations there. People are interested in what this means and what's coming out. What I want to say, and what I'll come back to, is that this is a platform for many, many discussions about the economy. It is not meant to solve your problems or guide your strategies, but rather kind of indicate in a general direction what are the pieces of the economy and how do they play together. So let me begin so this was released on May 2nd, a little over a month ago. We've been to a couple of forums now, and we wouldn't be here today if we didn't think it was not only important, but also very timely as we come out of this recession. Many of you already know the fund, and Bob gave a great introduction, and I'll just reiterate that we're a collaboration of over 50 philanthropic organizations from across Northeast Ohio, and we are dedicated to promoting regional economic competitiveness agenda. Is my mic working okay if I step away? Great. Okay. All right, and here are some of our grantees. Many of you are familiar with some of these logos. And our work is guided, over $60 million has been really guided by research. What's important in the economy, and how do we work regionally together to be sure that we're investing in things that matter. And these are things that span from workforce investments to advanced technologies and advanced energy and flexible electronics, manufacturing and small to mid-sized manufacturers, land use policies. The Northeast Ohio Sustainable Communities Consortium is also one of our grantees. Jumpstart, working with entrepreneurs, Team NEO on business attraction. All these things are important to the long-term health of the economy. And here's some of our past research that told us this. It started with a white paper out of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland in 2006. And since then, Cleveland State University and other partners in the research community have really helped us gauge from year to year what those indicators are that are really important. As we moved forward and we thought about what this next iteration would look like, as Bob said, we wanted to rebrand it. It wasn't so much about, okay, how are we doing on the poverty rates or BA degrees this year from year to year, because a lot of that stuff doesn't move too much. Things like inequality or educational attainment, those are going to take years to really change. And we shifted the focus, particularly coming out of this recession, to understand in a post-recession economy, how is the economy changing in ways that we've not seen before. And I'm going to jump to this report here and just highlight 3 findings of this new report. And then we'll come back to them in a bit, but I don't want you to hold your breath. So the first finding, if you haven't read the report yet, is that education and innovation are more interconnected than we've seen them before. The second observation is that in the places where we saw higher self-employment rates, business starts, these are places with entrepreneurial activity. These were the places that were more diverse and more integrated than other metropolitan areas. Interesting bedfellows there, surprising to many. And the third observation, and this is the most surprising, I think, and sobering observation that has gotten the most attention if you saw it in some of the press clippings in the last month, or if you heard a radio spot, is that the places we saw increase the most in terms of job growth are some of the poorest places with the highest crime and highest inequality in the country. So those places where we really saw over the last 2 decades highest job growth, over 50%, these are some of the places that we've seen are in the most trouble. Yes? Sure. Okay. All So this is taking you, before we move forward, into what each one of those findings means and how we got there. I just want to remind everyone where we are as a region relative to the nation. And this is a chart with Northeast Ohio being that red line and the US being that dotted blue line. And you can see that we've been underperforming the nation for decades. If we went back further, this would be true back through since the late 70s as well. Our research particularly focused on the period between 1990 and 2011. And you can see that generally Northeast Ohio underperforms the national economy. I did want to point out, though, that there has been times in the past where we have outperformed the national economy. That happened in the early 90s, and we can talk about that a little bit more later. But then you see we dropped back down again. What we see coming out of this recession is that we're actually outperforming the national economy in the recovery on 3 metrics: output, productivity, and per capita income. That bodes well for future employment growth. If you boost your productivity and you're paying higher wages, you're more likely to hire, you're more likely to grow as a company. It's a good sign for our economy. We're on a good track. So now what we wanted to know from this research was, okay, how do we keep going? How do we sustain that growth so we don't fall back down again? So I'm going to take you through a little bit of the methodology. We looked at 115 mid-sized metros. Those are metropolitan areas that range from about 400,000 people, which is roughly the size of Canton, to up to 3.5 million, which is like the size of a San Diego, for example. Those were across the country, collecting a lot of data, and of course, what do we care about most? Is Northeast Ohio. So there you see Cleveland up there on the lake. We're a little over 2 million people, and then we have, like I said, Akron, Youngstown, and Canton as well in this Northeast Ohio region. These are our 4 largest metropolitan areas. We represent 166 billion in gross product and 4 million people together as a region. Sorry, technology problems. Okay. All right, I'm gonna put that down. Okay. So we looked at data on 55 different variables from each of these 115 metros, and here's your list. So we looked at a lot of data. We looked at housing data, we looked at crime data, broadband, obesity, health insurance coverage, and we got a lot of input from some of you all in the audience, but you might recall that we reached out to a lot of experts over the course of last summer before we did the data collection to really get your input on what these variables should be. And these 55 variables grouped into 6 factors. We conducted a factor analysis. We didn't just pick and choose what we wanted to track ourselves on. This is an important point because it's how we're different than a lot of other dashboards, if you will. So these grouped into 6 factors that you'll see here. They're talked about in the report. All 6 represent about 71% of the variation from metropolitan area to metropolitan area. You'll see, I'm going to go through each one of them just so people understand that when we say things like education and innovation, we're actually talking about a whole bunch of different variables. We're talking about tech transfer, patents, BA degrees, advanced degrees, investment, university R&D, and interestingly, on this indicator, we're also talking about non-car commutes, a generally younger population. Then we move to entrepreneurship and inclusion. That's where we see high percentages of foreign-born, high percentages of self-employment, business starts. There's a secondary correlation to patents and venture capital. So these are you can unpack these. There is just so much data that we can use coming out of this report that we can further investigate. Economic polarization, you'll see I mentioned inequality. It's also poverty, crime, health insurance coverage, low income rates. Business costs is another factor. It's talked a little less about. You'll see it in the report. That's made up of unionization rates, energy tax, tax cost index, energy costs as well. And then dynamics of place. That has to do with housing and manufacturing shares, and then connectivity, which is commute times and domestic air travel. So these indicators are statistically related with each other. They either move up or down with one another across these different metropolitan areas. And I just wanted to spend a little time on this so you understand that there's actually a lot of data behind those titles that you see. Okay, so these are the three that we're most closely focused on in the report, and it's what we're going to talk about today. They represent 50% of the variation from metropolitan area to metropolitan area. The six together are 70%, but these three represent 50% of the variation. Okay, and what of all this data actually matters to the economy, right? That's what we're here to solve for. And we're going to look at that now. We don't just care about output. We don't just care about jobs. These are the four measures that we want to know what moves them. What moves GMP, which is gross metropolitan product, the output of the entire economy, jobs, per capita income, and productivity. So we're actually looking at four different growth measures and their relationship to each of these three variables. So let's take the first one. So you can see that education and innovation is positively related to GMP, per capita income, and productivity. There's no positive or negative relationship to job growth, but you can see that education and innovation is absolutely critical in any healthy economy. So here are some of the metros in the darker green that scored the highest on this indicator. What we found was many of these metros were some of the anchor metros. Here's Durham, Chapel Hill as an example. They had the younger populations. They're benefiting from strong university and hospital systems. These were the ones that we really saw score pretty high in this education innovation related factor. And as we jump to Northeast Ohio, and particularly the Cleveland metropolitan area, there is a lot of activity here on education and innovation, and we actually, as a metropolitan area, scored relatively high compared to the rest of the region. I think we are about ranked number 59, I believe, out of 115 metros, which is fairly high. We benefit from, a strong innovation ecosystem, lots of initiatives, the Innovation Center at Lorain County Community College and Nortec and CASE and the Ohio Third Frontier investments, PRISM that comes out of Magnet to really help small to mid-sized manufacturers innovate. We have a robust ecosystem, bioenterprise and biomedical. So this is just a tremendous asset for us and a really, not to a surprise to the folks in this room, but a huge asset for Cleveland and for the region. Okay, so now we move to entrepreneurship and inclusion. So again, I just want to reiterate that this means the places that we saw the higher business starts, the higher self-employment rates, these were the places that were generally more inclusive and more integrated. So they had less African American segregation, higher percentages of foreign born, for example. And you'll see that these were the metros that on every measure were positively associated with economic growth. Okay, so here's your map. And an example that we're throwing out there is Austin, Texas. I forgot to look up the exact slogan, but I think they have a slogan that's like make Austin, or keep Austin weird, something like that. Is that right? Okay, so Austin has a very innovative ecosystem. They have the university there, but also a very strong sense of entrepreneurship, and that's both. It's really important to recognize that entrepreneurship is both kind of the population serving type of mom and pop shops that are your grocery stores or your salons, as well as the higher tech entrepreneurship and the venture capital and the high innovation. And then we move to Northeast Ohio, and we do have, we benefit from, again, a very strong entrepreneurial ecosystem here. Evergreen just came up from Columbus, ECDI from Columbus, and the Blackstone Launchpad was launched just recently. These are more recent initiatives. Then there's Jumpstart for the last 10 years that has been kind of investing in this area, in the Jumpstart Entrepreneurial Network. And we also benefit from other organizations like Entrepreneurs Edge and Bizdom and Glide and Launch House. So this is clearly an area that we've invested heavily in as a region, and we do, specifically in the Cleveland Metro, we rank somewhere in the middle on this indicator. So there is room to be scaled up, but there is a lot of activity there. All right, and then we come to the last one, and this is really the one that I said caused us to pause when the results first came back. And so we see here that things like inequality, poverty, and crime were positively associated with job growth over the period 1990 to 2011, and negatively associated with things like per capita income growth. So I just want to reassert what this means. So when we looked at the metros that grew the most, and here's probably the best example of this, if you looked at just McAllen, Texas, and you wanted to look at job growth, 109% job growth. That's great, right? You look at McAllen and you say, wow, they did really good over the last 2 decades. And then you look over here at our index for what economic polarization, what's in there, if you remember, crime, poverty, low income, low health insurance, and they were the worst. So I think this just shows that you can't just look at job growth. And of course, every single metropolitan area up here has their own story. Las Vegas is kind of the poster child for that boom and bust economy. And we can unpack these stories, but the main message here is that if you just looked at job growth, you're only getting a little piece of the picture, that it's not just about jobs, but it's about good jobs. And so it caused us at the fund to think, okay, well, where are the places that we're able to balance job growth with, without exacerbating inequality or exacerbating poverty? And there were only a few metros up there that we really saw did this. One of the ones we saw was Denver. They have tighter city-suburban linkages. They didn't see 100% job growth, but they still saw 30%. And they were able to see this economic polarization variable. They weren't at the top of the list for the highest inequality metros, right? So we were able to pull out a couple metros, but the point here is that it's hard. It is hard to do both. And if we're gonna do that in a recovery, and if we're gonna sustain our growth, we have to be very intentional about it, and we have to be very careful about it, and it's gonna take time. Some of the initiatives here in Northeast Ohio, specifically here in Cleveland, Towards Employment and Work Advance, it's an initiative that's in Mahoning County and Cuyahoga County to bring those low to mid-skill workers up through a pathway or a career path to connect them with the training they need to be successful in sectors specifically in health and manufacturing. So you're not just giving someone a job for 6 months or a year, but you're following them through that path from the time they enter the Towards Employment office to the time they get that raise 2 years down the line, or get that promotion. So that's a program that's currently, it's experimental. It's happening in a couple places around the country, but it's meant to really inform, how we look at workforce and workforce investments. United Way Northeast Ohio Sustainable Communities Consortium, the social service sector. There's so many different organizations that are really trying to look at this issue in terms of, the long-term assets that we have and how to connect the people who need jobs and stability to the assets they need to get there, to get to work, to connect them to the assets that this community has. So just to end, we went through each of those findings, and that last one about economic polarization, as we're coming out of this recovery, it can't just be about education and innovation. It can't just be about entrepreneurship. There's clearly no one solution. What we do know is that if we kind of continue down this path of just looking at one or two metrics, it may not get us where we need to be. And this is a quote from Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel economist. We typically talk about rising inequality and the sluggish recovery as separate phenomena when they are in fact intertwined. Inequality stifles, restrains, and holds back our growth. So as we look not 6 months ahead or a year ahead or 2 years ahead, but rather 5, 10, 20 years down the line, where do we want Northeast Ohio to stand? And we don't want to just keep underperforming or even perform at the national level. We want to go above and beyond. We need to take stock in what those things are that we're investing in today. And again, just to remind you, this is that map of Northeast Ohio's underperformance, and we really want to see that change. And again, it's not for today, but for 20 years down the line that we want to see sustained economic growth. I'm going to end there. The reason why you're here today, I think, is in small part to hear me blabber on about the economy, but also to talk about how this all affects you in the Cleveland metropolitan area. And we have a phenomenal panel that Denise is going to introduce. And this is Denise Seaman, one of our hosts from the St. Luke's Foundation. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody, and really thank you for being here on a beautiful Friday morning. Isn't she amazing? Great. When I hear people like Emily and many people you'll hear from, I'm really encouraged. I'm encouraged about the future of this community, I've been here for 61 years. Hardly seems possible, but to see even this space that we are so blessed to have is just an indicator that things are good and things are going to get better. So Bob mentioned our board met yesterday, our St. Luke's Foundation board met yesterday, and we approved another 3-year grant to the Fund for Our Economic Future. We've been part of that collaboration since its inception, but not because we're an economic development funder, we're a health funder. When we first got into this, we thought, is this really our mission? But it was philanthropic collaboration, and at our heart, we are collaborators. And so we've joined the table, we've come to the table, and we've stayed at the table mainly because of it's philanthropic collaboration. But as the fund and its work has evolved, and particularly this research about what matters most to metros, not suddenly really, but gradually over time, the work of a health funder that we care about, health and well-being, has really merged with the work of economic development. Because one of the things that we've learned as a health funder is the importance of place. We are very lucky in Cleveland to have our Cuyahoga County Place Matters team. They have been really busy educating us on the impact of place on health and well-being. Health being the communities in which people live, grow, work, worship, play, and are educated. And what we've learned is the disproportionate distribution of assets around our community that negatively impact certain communities, the communities that our foundation cares most about. and has really led to many of the inequities. And without getting into a huge conversation about place matters, I say that to say that now, yesterday, our board was able to approve a grant that's really a fit on mission. It's no longer just because there's other foundations at the table, but because our work, this work about this place that we call home, has become intertwined, and we really recognize how very important place is and what is in that place to outcomes that look at health and well-being, the economy, economic development, and so forth. So anyway, it's a wonderful convergence, and so at this point, we need to know what you all need to know about this research as it relates to your work. This is going to be a brief period of question and answers before we open it up to our panel discussion. But Emily's here, Brad is here, Brad Whitehead, president of the fund, is here to answer any specific questions that you might have about the research. Brad, you want to come up? Yes. Yes.
I was just thinking we got Mark Snyder in.
Yeah, we have lots of really knowledgeable people here.
So my question is deemed innovation is evaluated on each of the metro areas. How do they evaluate, how do they determine how we rank 59th in innovation?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
So innovation was one of the things you talked about in all these metro areas. It was rated. We rated 59th or something like that.
Right.
How is the rating determined?
Okay, so remember education and innovation was a group of 16 different variables, right? So it was a composite kind of indicator. And then each one of those metropolitan areas got a factor score. So they got a score for that composite factor. And then those were ranked.
Okay,
So it could have been what I think you're going toward is that if you wanted to see what weighted that, where did Cleveland Metro within those 16 variables really outperform, where did it underperform, this is where this gets fun, is that I refer you to the database online that's absolutely public, and you can see all the scores. And people can play with the different metros and see and sort by any of those 16 variables to see where we outperform, where we underperform.
Do you have any data as to specifically what is looked at in innovation?
Yes, so tech transfer, patents, venture capital, industry R&D, university R&D, those were some of those innovation-related variables.
Yes, thank you.
I think it's important just to do a shout out for Cleveland State University, who carried a lot of the analytic load on this and shaped a lot of the thinking and such. And I know we have Irina Lindell here, Ziona Austrian, who's the leader of the team that will be up here on a panel in a bit, and Marissa Piazza, I think, is around somewhere, or if not here today. But Cleveland State was just a phenomenal partner in all of this.
A question back here?
Yes, my question is, in your graph, you said that Northeast Ohio is outperforming the national average in recent years. Does your data suggest what changed in the past few years that may have affected the pace of Northeast Ohio growth versus the country growth?
That's a good deeper dive. But I will say that generally what happened and what we saw in the early 90s too was that we had a bigger drop compared to the nation. So it's easy for us to, not easy, right? We still have to do really well coming out of any recession to be able to outperform the national economy. But when we do that poorly and we got into the recession deeper and earlier than other metropolitan areas, it makes the growth tends to be a little higher that next year. But as far as what's kind of driving our recovery, I will say Team NEO has been doing really quarter-to-quarter research on this, and it looks like our manufacturing output is, above and beyond what the national rate right now, and that's really driving our recovery here in this region.
And I would just add to this as well that kind of what we're seeing and feeling and will be curious how you see and think about this, but there is the palpable sense around town, and I hope this data is at least correlated with it if it doesn't confirm it, that we now have a set of industry sectors that do seem to be giving us a lift, and we've benefited from the fact that the chemicals and coatings industry has done well, and as Emily said, certain areas of manufacturing has done well. And then if you just remember a decade ago, we were nowhere in terms of entrepreneurship and business starts and things of that sort. So there is this sense, and we have this conversation inside the fund, that the ship is turning. And then now, as Denise just noted, the ship is turning, but we're also mindful of the fact that it's pretty unevenly distributed right now. And we really, this is a great moment to pay heed to what's happening in a lot of the communities that may be being left behind.
Earl next. Whoa.
One really simple question and a slightly longer question. I'm curious why obesity is grouped under entrepreneurship and inclusion.
Yeah.
That's my quick question. My longer question is, like I think everybody else in the room, I was stunned by this correlation between job growth and economic polarization.
Yeah.
My question is, were you able to dig a little bit deeper in the data and look at patterns of job growth, kinds of job growth, and economic polarization? So is all different, not all jobs are equal.
Right.
Different kinds of job growth are likely to have different impacts. So were you
Yeah.
able to tease that out?
We got this question, Akron, too. It's a great one. And I think over the next year to 2 years, this is when we're going to do the deeper dives about, I know we've done our own studies at the fund, what are those driver industries that have higher wages? And we're kind of going through that data now, but that was not what this study was about. It was generally pointing in the direction of, you know, we didn't do part-time versus full-time jobs. I think that's a main thing coming out of here is when you hear about jobs or employment numbers, you're talking about any job that a company reports. So you don't have those breakdowns, and that's where you need to get a little more detailed and scratch the surface. As far as things like obesity, I wanted to say there's a lot of interesting, maybe that's why I saw about 50 hands. There's a lot of interesting things that group together that we weren't, you know, we're still not sure about. And I was a little nervous about putting the whole list up there, but I was encouraged by many people to just, you know, I'm putting it out there. All the data is public. These are statistical correlations. And I think the obesity was interesting because where you saw those more diverse populations, there were higher percentages of foreign-born, higher percentages of African American. That's where you tend to get the higher obesity rates. So you could explain it that way. But of course, big disclaimer here, it depends what metro you're looking at. So that's where you really need to go. That's why you really need to look at which metro and what trends are there. Of course.
Okay.
Ziona Austrian from CSU.
Yeah, I'm Ziona Austrian. This group, statistically, you have variables that grouped into these factors. And that means that these variables in the metro areas move together. However, they can move in opposite relationships. So if you look at the detailed data, obesity really is negatively related to entrepreneurship and business starts. So they don't move in the same direction, they move in opposite direction. But they move together.
Right here? Yeah. I was just, Cindy Andrews, I've been out of the region for 2 years, and I'd like to applaud the group because I wonder how many other cities are now holding up Cleveland and the metro area as an example. So I'd like to start with that. And secondly, my question about workforce and returning vets. I obviously just glanced and did not see that, and I'm just curious if that's something that we're considering as a metro area.
Returning.
The importance
of
viewing the returning veterans
Yes.
as a critical asset of people who've had great life experiences and skills.
Okay,
So
got it.
absolutely, and there are some very exciting programs being led by community colleges and some of the 4 years, as well as some social service agencies. I think the question is, have we knitted it together and really taken it to the scale that we can? And yes, the world is taking notice of what we're all doing in Northeast Ohio. Just last week alone, the National Journal went and looked at great ideas around the U.S. and anointed Northeast Ohio as the best example of a regional economic strategy, lessons that Washington can learn from. And the Brookings Institution came out a week ago, Monday, with a book discussing the Metropolitan Revolution and dedicated a chapter on Northeast Ohio. And the principal part of the chapter was that we're a post-hero economy. That what we have done and the kind of change that we've made has been because we've built these networks of players, networks within sectors, but networks across sectors. And we've realized and been able to operationalize that this is a team sport.
Yes.
We're sitting in this phenomenal resource, which is just one of many, which really contributes to our lifestyles. So I guess my question is, did your study take into consideration the lifestyles and the things that are available to us, as well as cost of living and other variables related to that?
Yeah, we had a couple quality of life variables, not all of them grouped. Some of them group, some of them don't group with other things and other trends. Things like, I mean, I'm trying to remember if we had something on green space. We did have air quality, we had water quality in there. We looked at commute times. There were things related to quality of life, but I think you're getting at the green space question or acreage. There are certain indicators that did fall here. I can say that air quality, for example, falls in this particular analysis, and we do see correlations, but.
It's more about lifestyle enhancements that are available to us.
Yeah.
Cultural, environmental, what have you.
We had something for arts occupations that grouped with the first innovation in education. So those places that were more innovative, higher educated, tended to have more arts amenities. We played around with it a little, but we could have probably done more in that area, for sure.
So I'm sorry, I know there are great questions to be had, but we have this phenomenal panel. Perhaps some of them will answer some of the questions without even being asked. We do have to continue and stay on time because we did promise to get you out of here at 10. So at this point, we're going to not take any more questions generally about the research. Emily and Brad will be here, right after if you want to get